George R.R. Martin didn't invent the kind of fantasy that changed everything. Someone did it first. Someone who wrote a sprawling, brutal epic with morally complicated characters, a world where good and evil aren't clearly labeled, where beloved characters suffer and die for reasons that feel genuinely unfair. His name is Tad Williams, and I'm willing to bet most of you have never heard of him. That ends today. Let me set the scene. It's 1988. Fantasy fiction is still largely living in Tolkien's shadow, heroic quests, clear moral lines, elves and dwarves in their proper places. Then Tad Williams publishes The Dragonbone Chair, the first volume of what would become the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn trilogy. And something shifts. Something fundamental about what fantasy could be, what it could do, what it could say about real human experience. Williams was working in Silicon Valley, yes, really, when he set out to write what he described as a response to Tolkien. Not a rejection of it, but a complication of it. He wanted to ask, what does the classic Hidden King returns to reclaim his throne story actually look like from the inside? What are the real human costs? What happens to the ordinary people caught in the middle of someone else's prophecy? The series follows Simon, a kitchen scullion, basically a medieval dishwasher, who gets swept into a war over the soul of a kingdom called Osten Ard. And here's where it already gets interesting. Because Simon is not a secret prince who is secretly good at everything. He's clumsy. He's scared. He makes genuinely terrible decisions. He's a teenager who grows up in real time across 4 massive books. In 1988, this was not just unusual, it was revolutionary. Here's the argument I want to make, and I want you to really follow me on this, because I think it changes how you understand the last 30 years of fantasy fiction. Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn is the missing link. It's the bridge between Tolkien's mythic archetypes and Martin's brutal realism. Without Williams, Game of Thrones as we know it simply does not exist, and Martin has said as much himself. We'll get to that. What Williams did that Tolkien never quite managed was take the architecture of epic fantasy and fill it with genuine psychological realism. His characters don't just represent virtues and vices, they have childhoods that haunt them, traumas they can't process, loves they can't quite express. And the villain, Iluki the Storm King, is one of the first truly tragic antagonists in modern fantasy. He isn't evil because evil is his nature. He's evil because history broke him. This is where the books do something genuinely uncomfortable. The Storm King's war on humanity isn't random malevolence. It's the consequence of a genocide that happened centuries before our story begins. An act committed by the very kingdom that now considers itself the righteous side. Williams forces us to sit with a really hard question. What if the heroes of the old story were actually the villains? What if the darkness they're fighting is darkness they created? This theme runs through every page of the trilogy. The 3 swords, Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, each carry the weight of a terrible past choice. The kingdom's history is one long accumulation of moral compromise. And Simon, our hero, has to navigate a world where knowing the truth doesn't make anything simpler. It makes everything more complicated. Which is, honestly, a far more honest model of how history actually works than anything Tolkien gave us. Williams also does something brilliant with prophecy. Epic fantasy is full of chosen ones and destined heroes. It's almost a structural requirement of the genre. But Williams keeps undercutting the prophecy's clarity. Characters keep misreading the signs. They act on incomplete information and pay devastating prices for it. The prophecy isn't wrong exactly, but it's never what anyone thinks it is. Sound familiar? Martin took this exact mechanism and built an entire career around it. Let's talk about the prose for a second, because this gets undersold. Williams writes with an almost architectural patience. The first book is deliberately slow in its middle section, and readers sometimes bounce off that. But that slowness is load-bearing. He's constructing a world that needs to feel real before it can feel devastating. Every detail he plants in those early chapters pays off hundreds of pages later. The foreshadowing is so dense it rewards multiple reads, which is rare. The payoff in the final volume, to Green Angel Tower, is extraordinary. If you've read it, you know the moment I mean, when everything the entire series has been building toward finally converges, and the answer to the central mystery reframes everything you thought you understood. Williams earns that ending completely. It is one of the great conclusions in the history of the genre, and almost no one outside of dedicated fantasy readers has ever experienced it. So let's connect this to something you probably do know. When Game of Thrones premiered on HBO, a whole generation encountered fantasy that felt real, political, morally ambiguous for the first time. Ned Stark dying in Season 1 was a cultural moment precisely because it violated the unspoken rules of the genre. Except Tad Williams had been writing characters like Ned Stark, fundamentally decent people in a world that punishes decency, since 1988. There's also a fascinating parallel to what literary critics call the post-heroic turn in storytelling. After Vietnam, after Watergate, Western culture stopped believing in uncomplicated heroes. That skepticism took decades to reach fantasy fiction, and when it finally arrived, it came through writers like Williams. He was doing for fantasy what Cormac McCarthy was doing for the Western, taking a deeply archetypal genre and asking hard questions about what those archetypes were actually built on. If you've read Patrick Rothfuss's Kinkler Chronicle, Joe Abercrombie's First Law series, or even Brandon Sanderson's more psychologically complex work, you're reading the children of memory, sorrow, and thorn. The grimdark movement, the deconstruction of the hero's journey, the emphasis on moral and political complexity, all of it has roots in what Williams was building in the late 80s. He didn't just influence Martin. He influenced the whole generation that came after Martin. And here's what makes all of this feel urgent right now. We're living in a moment where the stories we tell about power, about history, about who counts as a hero, and who gets written out of the record, these are genuinely contested questions. Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn has been asking those exact questions for 35 years. The Storm King's grief isn't ancient fictional history. It's the logic of every unresolved historical wound that keeps bleeding into the present. Now here's the part I really want you to hear, because this genuinely surprised me when I first learned it. George R.R. Martin has explicitly, publicly credited Tad Williams as one of the primary inspirations for A Song of Ice and Fire. He didn't hide it. He said that Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn showed him that epic fantasy could be taken seriously, could be literary, could have the complexity of the best mainstream fiction. Martin called it one of the most important fantasy series ever written. And yet this is the genuinely strange part. The student became astronomically more famous than the teacher. Game of Thrones became a global cultural phenomenon. Williams, who made it possible, remained beloved among hardcore fantasy readers and nearly invisible to everyone else. The sequel series, The Last King of Osten Ard, began publishing in 2017. It has a few thousand reviews on Goodreads. A few thousand. For a direct sequel to one of the most architecturally influential fantasy series in history. One more thing, and this is the detail I keep coming back to. The title of the final book, To Green Angel Tower, refers to a specific structure in the story, but it's also a deliberate echo of medieval literary tradition, where towers symbolize human aspiration reaching dangerously toward heaven. Williams was trained in literature and mythology, and the whole series is dense with that kind of layered resonance. It's not just a fantasy novel. It's a meditation on memory itself, on how we build stories about the past to justify what we want to do in the present. So here's what I want us to take away together. Every time you watched Game of Thrones and felt the thrill of a fantasy world that felt genuinely real and morally honest, there was a predecessor, a blueprint, a series that did the hard, unglamorous work of proving it was possible. Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn is that blueprint, and understanding it changes how you understand everything that came after, including the stories you already love. Williams wrote a series about the cost of stories, the way we mythologize the past, the way heroes get constructed and broken, the way the winners write the history while the losers become monsters in someone else's legend. That's not just a fantasy theme. That is the central challenge of being a thoughtful person in a complicated world. These books deserve to be read not just as fantasy, but as a sustained argument about how we live with inherited darkness. If this changed how you think about where epic fantasy really comes from, the deep roots, the forgotten architects, the debts that never got paid, you'll love our video on how Tolkien himself was processing the trauma of World War I and why that grief shapes every fantasy novel written since. The roots go deeper than you think. We'll see you there.